Need to get the Lambo and drive. I was in the lab, you were on my mind, but all I really do is just go. I was in the bando a long, long time. Need to get the Lambo and drive. I was in the lab, you were on my mind, but all I really do is just grind. I had to get it on my own. Had to break the pound in the zones. I had to get it on my own. Had to break the pound in the zone. I had 20K all in the mattress. Made the work disappear like magic. Had to get it clean, now I'm making smash hits. Now they know my name all around the atlas. Still drinking Henny in a red cup. Big bro told me keep your head up. I was down a few bands, I was fed up.
Hello, boys. Welcome. So yeah, today's session will be on. We're just gonna go through a book, and I'll be sharing the book with you all later anyway. And I'll also share the page numbers also on which various parts that we're going to discuss. Okay, so let me just share. So the book we are discussing is Diamonds in the Dust by Saurabh Mukherjee. So this book, in fact, was released just recently after the pandemic, and it has some really cool insights. Okay, so we'll run through the insights. So yeah, so the first thing, right, that this book highlights really well is when it comes to buying a company, accounting quality is extremely important. Okay, so let us look at so see this example. Okay, so till 2008, Satyam Computers. Okay, so this was one of the top IT companies at that time, and they were in the same league as Infosys, TCS, Wipro, and HCL. So you can imagine today, if the company still existed, it would have been on that level. And over the 5-year period from 2003 to 2008, Satyam's revenue had grown at a CAGR of 31%. So you can only imagine what kind of growth this company is all about. Just hold on a second. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So what I was saying was Satyam's revenue had grown at a CAGR of 31%. Okay, the third highest among the large listed IT peers. And profit after tax had a CAGR of 34%. So imagine what your capital could have grown like. Now, what happened is this guy Ramalinga Raju, the promoter and chairman of Satyam, in a letter to the company's board, admitted to large-scale falsification of the company's financial results, including inflation of revenues and profits, understating of liability and inflation of cash and bank balances. Now, the reported cash and bank balance was 5,361 crores, while the actual amount was 94% lower at 321 crores. Now, how he did this was he siphoned cash out from Satyam to buy land and properties in his personal name using many different means. One of the main ones that he used was creation of fake employees who were paid salaries. So basically, he would create fake employees and pay those salaries out, which would in the end go to him only at the end of the day. And that money he used to use to buy properties. Now, at one point when it became difficult to manage and suppress the widening gap between the action reported, he basically sought to merge two of his family-owned entities, that is Maita's Properties and Maita's Infrastructure, with Satyam. So the plan was to pay for the acquisition using the fictitious cash on the Satyam books. So what he was going to do is he was going to merge both these companies, and he was going to use all of this, fake amount of money to basically pay for that acquisition, which at the end of the day, obviously would have gone to him only, right? Now, since the cash was to be paid to Raja and his family, it did not matter whether any actual payments were made. In return, the assets of the Maita's company could be used to clean up the fraud. So this was his entire plan, and that led to the entire collapse of the company at the end. Now, coming to like one of the other interesting parts of this book is, so if you see here, strong correlation between accounting quality and shareholder returns. Okay. So if you see here, okay, so in the case of financial service companies with poor quality of accounting, destruction of shareholder wealth is a question of when and not if. So to support, this entire title, stage one, when investors do not know which companies have a poor quality of accounting. So there is a strong correlation between accounting quality and shareholder returns, irrespective of whether the subpar accounting practices of companies are common knowledge or not. Now, if you see, over here, okay, so this is one of the important parts. When investors know which companies have poor quality accounts, but their accounting fraud is not publicly knowledge, not public knowledge yet. So we see shareholders decide to invest in financial services companies despite being aware about this subpar accounting quality. Such investors are of the view that either the fraud won't come to light, or they will be able to exit the stock before the fraud becomes public knowledge, or they will have enough time to exit the stock once the fraud is public knowledge. So these are the common misconceptions that the investors have. Okay. Now, none of these arguments hold true. So what happens is, if you see here, okay, so I'll give you an example. So one was DHFL was one of the companies. Okay, so if you see here, okay, now look at this. So see this graph, it explains very well. So basically, yeah, so see this for Yes Bank and DHFL, okay. So what it says is, if you look here, so see here, even after a fraud is public knowledge, retail shareholders have the tendency to go bottom fishing. That is, investing in fraudulent company low prices in the hope of witnessing a miraculous turnaround story. Understood? No, it is a similar thing that's happening with crypto also today. If you see, what is happening is, because the cryptocurrency is at a low point where it had rallied before, people think that okay, it means once it goes back there, it will go up again. But what happens is, there's no fundamental underlying value to support that fall. Similarly, over here also, these stocks became like crypto because there was no fundamental underlying factor that was supporting the falls. So if you see over Yes Bank and DHFL, see this. So the for fraudulent or the issues with the company were already public. Okay. But now what is the issue? So the issue was here, see, so the stock started collapsing, but retail shareholder increased, which meant that when this fall was happening, retail shareholders said, it's the share is so much more cheaper, might as well go and buy it. And I don't think it will get out of the market. There'll probably be a turnaround. So like that, if you see in both these cases, Yes Bank, so the dotted line is the retail shareholding. See how it has increased. For DHFL also, same thing. See how it has increased while the share was collapsing. So that is the common misconception that is had. So that is what one thing that this book is highlighting really well. Okay, now coming to, yeah. So coming to this, so now this is another thing. So how to identify naughty financial services companies. So these are important ratios. Okay, so when you're analyzing financial service companies, if you can go through these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these 6 ratios, if you can apply, right? So on the income statement, balance sheet, and also for the auditors. Okay, so auditor data, of course, is on the annual report. So if you apply these 6 ratios, according to Marcellus, according to Saurabh Mukherjee, the person who wrote this book, he says that you'll be able to expose if a financial service company is into, some naughty accounting or not. So that is what they say. Okay, so you can have a look at this. Now, yeah, coming to the next. Yeah, so if we go down here, okay. Where is that? So yeah, one more thing that the book speaks about, okay. So what the accounting ratios? So the accounting ratios also above. No? So what does that tell us about DHFL? This is one of the most important ones. Fee income as a percentage of net interest income. So fee income represents all income other than interest and includes loan processing fees, banking charges, commissions earned on insurance sold. So basically when a bank sells insurance or whatever, there are these processing fees, banking charges, and all of this stuff. Okay. Now in 2018, fee income for DHFL was equivalent to a quarter of its net interest income. So you can only imagine the net interest income of an entire quarter, the fee income was equal to that. Now, a high fee income as a proportion of net interest income compared with peers suggests that a lender may be booking a higher upfront fee income to inflate profitability. Okay, so let us look at this further. To take a simple example, a lender who wants to inflate its short-term profitability may lend money to a high-risk borrower because the borrower is willing to pay a large upfront processing fee. So naturally, if no other lender is willing to lend money to this particular borrower, and if these guys say, okay, we'll lend the money to you, but you have to pay a high upfront fee, okay, and then we will lend the money to you, then naturally that borrower will agree, right? Because you're not getting money from anywhere else. Now, thanks to the upfront fee, the high risk borrower is able to raise debt and the lender is able to book the fee income upfront, thereby boosting its profitability. So it's a win-win situation for both, even though in reality, it's actually a huge negative. So now this sort of lending practice usually leads to what economists call adverse selection. Okay. That is, in the quest to increase short-term profitability, the lender ends up lending to only those borrowers who are willing to pay a large upfront fee income, naturally. And they would naturally be borrowers to whom no other lender wants to lend. So of course, these are the only kind of people who these guys would want to lend to. Now, this in turn leads to a buildup of risky loans, and while the P&L looks glossy, the risk keeps stacking up on the balance sheet, which later on backfires very badly. And this ratio raises a clear red flag, but needs to be corroborated with primary data checks and other checks on features such as the lending mix, fee generating capabilities, and all of that stuff. Okay, so this is another interesting thing the book had brought up. Now, so look at this, okay? So now Saurabh's 12-year-old daughter is a budding pastry chef. Okay, look at this example. Early on in her baking foray, she figured that if she wanted to make money from baking, sorry, then the recipe for generating cash flow was straightforward, right? She would have to obviously buy the ingredients required to bake a cake for rupees 100 or less and sell the cake for 150. So profit is 150. Now, once she had the rupees 50 in hand, she realized, and now she had to make some tricky decisions. Should she spend this money at the local ice cream parlor, or should she buy the latest books on baking? So she has two options: either enjoy the money, or naturally buy a book that would help her improve her baking. Right? At a very basic level, running a company is simply a scaled up version of what Saurabh's daughter is doing. So operating a firm is about using capital to drive a virtuous circle of resource allocation. Very important is how you allocate resources and capital. So if you look at ITC also today, I keep harping on this, right? So ITC has a tremendous amount of capital, but they are not allocating the capital in the right manner, which is causing the share price to stagnate basically. So what is happening is ITC is investing in hotels and other businesses which are not giving them the best return on capital employed, and this is causing an issue for the share. Now, firm uses capital to consume and invest in resources such as raw materials, utilities, research and development, technology, etc. Typically, resources consumed relates to the current requirements of a business and is classified as operating expense on the income statement. So naturally, whatever we need in the short term is on our profit and loss, right? As we saw in our classes. Now, on the other hand, resources invested relates to the future requirements of a business, right? So any expense, of course, is for the period of 1 year and it's for now. But any investment to make is for the future, right? Which will come in a balance sheet. Now, yeah, so consumption and investment of these resources then helps the firm produce products and provide services, which can then be sold to generate capital for the firm. This capital can then be reinvested into the business for further consumption and investment and hence future business growth. So have you understood the cycle? So you invest the money into raw materials, which can then be used to be, to generate revenue and profits for the business. And that profit can then be reinvested in the business. Understood? Now the capital available to the firm is limited and like all resources has a cost attached to it. So the cost of capital for most listed firms is around 12 to 15%. And ROCE measures the cash flow generated by firm per unit of capital employed. So if the ROCE earned by a firm is less than its cost of capital, it is unable to pay the capital providers. Understood, right? So if I take a loan, for example, for 10%, okay, and if the projects I'm investing are giving me only 6%, I'm not earning enough to pay that loan, right? So this is what the whole point is trying to say. Okay, so that's why what this part of the book is saying is it's very important how the money is reinvested. Okay. Now, coming to the next thing is, yeah, here. So sources of competitive advantage, another interesting thing this book highlights. Okay. So where do competitive advantages arise from? What are the sources from such a firm derives and sustain its edge over competition? So at the end of the day, all we're trying to figure out is economic moat. Okay, how does a company generate? One thing is supply. So strictly cost advantages that allow a company to produce and deliver its products serving more cheaply than its competitors. So naturally, if it has a service or supply chain network which supplies raw materials at a very cheap price, cheaper than every other competitor, then naturally that's a huge advantage. Demand, access to market demand that competitors cannot match. So naturally, there's a demand for your product which no other competitor can get. That in itself is again an economic mode. Economies of scale. What is economies of scale? Is if the cost per unit declines as volume increases, then even with the same basic technology, an incumbent firm operating at large scale will enjoy lower cost than its competitors. What is economies of scale? Not to cut a long story short, is if I give you an example, look at the local baking businesses. So if they get huge bulk orders, what happens is their profit margin improves, right? Why? Because those raw materials can be put to the best possible use to generate bulk. But now if someone gives an order to make only one or two brownies, it's a loss for that baker, right? Similarly, for a business, it's the same thing. That is what economics of scale is all about. The more you produce, the cheaper will be your cost per unit, and the higher will naturally will be your profit, because if your cost is low, your revenue is high, then the difference is a profit, right? It'll be higher. Now the next thing is innovation. So it's Asian Paints. So the book basically brings about example of Asian Paints, HDFC Bank, and Garware Technical Fibers. So Asian Paints, to cut the long story short, yeah, is India's paint sector's product. It's low margins for dealers. The seasonality of demand and the large number of stock keeping units, innovation and supply chain management is a key differentiator and critical success factor in the industry. So basically, these things is what Asian Paints achieves. Now it has a track record of running the most efficient supply chain network in India, one that makes 3 to 4 deliveries every day to more than 70,000 dealers in over 600 cities. This ensures high inventory turnover turns for a dealer, for whom the thin margins from a voluminous product is a key challenge in earning a reasonable return on capital. Understood, right? So what happens is they manage to achieve a high number of sales. Now, so these are just some of the initiatives that Asian Paints taken to strengthen its supply chain. Okay, so that is like using mainframes in the early 90s to focus demand for better inventory management, branch billing on computers in the late 90s. So Asian Paints is one of the first first companies to use a computer for data analytics and all of that. They imported a color computer in 1979, which helped reduce tinting time from 5 or 6 days down to 4 hours, and use a global positioning, so GPS system for tracking movement of trucks carrying finished goods in the channel. So all of this stuff helped it build its moat. Second company the book brings about is HDFC Bank, which one of the features that distinguishes it from its competitors is its management's ability to use technology in the broadest sense of the word, including hardware, software systems, and processes to create a unique offering. Okay. Now, basically, ICICI Bank was often the bank to come up with the most stylish technology-driven banking products. However, HDFC Bank's strength rests not so much in the uniqueness of the technologies it uses, but in the way it has lined up technology in a clever process flow that was not envisaged by other banks. Okay, so this is something that I keep in mind about HDFC Bank. So these are ways in which the bank managed to build its competitive advantage. So there are all of these parts that you all can read later when I give you the book. Garware Technical Fibers. It's a leading Indian as well as global player in the field of synthetic cordage and fibers used in fishing nets, aquaculture, sports nets. So basically anything to do with nets, Garware Technical Fibers is one of the companies that is leading in that field. So they make even football nets and any tennis nets, all of this kind of things. So yeah, so you can see in aquaculture and all of these things. So they are one of the leading producers over there. Second thing is brand. Okay, so brand is also extremely important. which Page Industries is, so Page Industries is a company that sells jockey products. So there they have built a strong brand. HDFC AMC, which is like basically the asset management company, that is another company that has a huge brand, which basically what this says is it flourished on the HDFC brand, basically HDFC Bank, HDFC, the main company on that brand, HDFC AMC flourished just because of the brand. Architecture also, so TCS is a prime example of a system of relationships within the firm. So, basically it speaks about the relationships within the firm, the hierarchy that is built. So TCS is one. Pidilite Industries is another, which has a strong architecture behind it. So see, even basically how the company sells its products. So through grocery shops, these pawn shops, stationery shops, hardware shops. So basically, all of this is what goes behind the architecture, building the competitive advantage. Okay, then strategic assets, of course. So if you see GMM Pfaudler, for example, is an Indian joint venture between Gujarat Machinery Manufacturers and Pfaudler Corporation. So promoters continue to run the company on a day-to-day basis, and is a 130-year-old multi-giant, basically a multi-giant founded by the inventor of the process of glasses, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, all of this stuff. Yeah, so this is one more important, interesting thing. So this part of the book basically highlights the sources of competitive advantage. Then coming to the next part is free cash flow, which is very, very important. Something that I recently realized also that leads to a huge, stock market success if the company has that. So the formula is what is earnings. So this is basically the formula. Okay. Now what the free cash flow says is, so, to cut a long story short, what free cash flow is free cash flow is basically the cash that is available to the company after all of these fixed expenses and all these liabilities are paid. Basically, the cash that is available that can be reinvested in projects to generate higher returns. Okay, this is what free cash flow is all about. So the book basically stresses on how important free cash flow is when it comes to generating or compounding returns. Okay, so that is one of the things. Okay, now this is my favorite part. No, this is my second favorite part. Okay, so I'll come to my favorite part. It's down. So what this part of the book says now is it speaks about diversification. Okay, so over here, if you see the examples, it's comparing a single sector focused company with a conglomerate. So conglomerates are companies that are basically invested in multiple industries. So if you see Grasim Industries, it's into natural fibers. So they're unrelated sectors. So natural fibers, cement, financial services, totally different. Mahindra and Mahindra is into automobile, financial service, logistics, IT. L&T is into construction and engineering, financial services, IT services. Reliance is into petroleum, retail, telecom. So these are diversified, they're conglomerates. So what it says is the average 10-year return on capital employed was like this, 15%. Now they compare it to sector focus. So a company that specializes in focus on only one thing. So in comparison to Grasim, there's Shri Cements, which is manufacturing cement, okay? 18.3%. So they're basically showing you how a company that is focused is managing to generate a higher return than a company that's trying to diversify. So if you see a Mahindra and Mahindra with Maruti Suzuki, both into cars, passenger vehicles, Maruti achieved a higher return. L&T compared with Pidilite for basically, all of this construction material and also we see 35% in comparison to 13%. Reliance Industries also compared with Asian Paints, okay? 44% Asian Paints, 11% Reliance. So you can see the difference when it comes to diversification, how sectors fell. Now, it's not only important to understand about the fact that it's focused. The second thing to understand is there are also conglomerates with disastrous outcomes for shareholders. So for example, here if you see Videocon tried to diversify into telecom, oil, media, okay, unrelated diversifications. And what is the outcome? Had to file for bankruptcy. UV Group, they were into liquor. Suddenly they tried to go into airlines. Vijay Mallya basically. Again, airline business under liquidation. Jai Prakash Associates, then to construction, they tried to go into cement, hydropower and all, had to declare bankruptcy. Alok Industries, they went to textiles. Suddenly they went to into real estate and all, had to declare bankruptcy. Lanco Infratech, into construction. Suddenly they went to venture into power generation, real estate and all, and currently under liquidation. So have you seen how these things play out? Okay. So now coming to the next part is timing the market. So everybody has this question, how do you time the market? Okay. So now what they are saying here, right, is let me come. So what the book, cut a long story short, what the book is saying is it is not possible to time the market. And the benefits of trying to time the market is very low. It doesn't make sense to try and time the market. So to give you an overview of that, look at this table. So this is speaking about only long-term steady and consistent investing. Okay. So look over here. So first is periods of 30 years, 20 years, and 10 years. They've taken different time periods. Now, for a person who tried to buy the 52-week low, this would have been their returns. Okay. This is in long-term on average for long-term consistent for good companies. Now, if they bought on the 1st of January each year, regardless of where the price was. So this is now only buying at lows, right? This is regardless of where the price was, just buying every year, 1st of January. See the excess returns. In 30 years, you managed to generate only additional 0.7%. 20 years only additional 1.6%. 10 years only additional 2%. What the point that this table is trying to make is, what is the point in taking so much effort in trying to time the market when the reward for the same is very low? It doesn't make sense. Okay, so that is what it's trying to say is it doesn't make sense to try and time the market. It doesn't make sense. Now, the next thing is, look at this, okay? So see this. So basically they labeled the two people. So this is Mr. Gifted is the person who could time the market, and Mr. Mortal, person who couldn't time the market. Okay, so now see this. See the difference. Hardly anything. So Mr. Gifted and Mr. Mortal, their difference was hardly anything. It didn't even make sense for Mr. Gifted to try and time the market. Okay, so this is the point that this part is trying to make. Now coming to the next thing, see this, okay? So for consistent compounders, so for good companies, we're talking about only good companies. So for good companies, Mr. Mortal and Mr. Gifted, 10-year period. See the excess return, 1.6%, 1.5%, 1.8%, 1. So the point is, does it even make sense to try and time the market? See the 20-year period is even less. Look at this. So at the end of the day, what this part of the book is speaking about in terms of timing the market is, it doesn't make sense to time the market because the percentage difference that I'm gaining, it doesn't compensate the effort. Now, for non-consistent compounders, so these are all consistent compounders, good companies. Now, for companies that are not all that great, Mr. Mortal, Mr. Gifted, again, see the differences. Can you see? So these are examples of the same. Can you see the difference? Okay. So what is it saying is, now here as it is, the risk is lower. Here the risk is so much larger. Still, if you see the excess returns, doesn't compensate the huge increased risk. Understood? This is basically what this thing is all about. What this part of the book is trying to say. And now coming to the last interesting part of the book. Conclusion. Lessons from Rahul Dravid. Shantanu and Vedan will definitely be able to relate to this stuff. So pay attention to this. This part is really interesting. So while Dravid's technical proficiency as a test batter was of a very high order, what really set him apart were the mental routines and mind conditional regimen that he followed from his school days. This preparation and his visualization techniques not only allowed him to identify his own weaknesses, but also gave him the capacity to remedy these weaknesses himself. Dravid's success was therefore driven as much by his behavioral traits as by his technical skills. In this regard, Dravid is a great role model for aspiring equity investors. Why is it so hard to be like Dravid? So now let us understand. Okay. So at the core of outside success in any walk of life, including batting and investing, lies the ability of a small number of individuals to train their minds to achieve outcomes that appear to be beyond the reach of 99% of the population. While what these individuals do might be simple, that does not mean it is easy. There are, broadly speaking, four reasons why it is not easy to bat like Rahul Dravid. Firstly, his training and his basic mental conditioning began when he was around 8 years old. So what is he trying to say is, long before Malcolm Gladwell wrote about his famous 10,000 hours of practice principle in Outliers, scores of Indian coaches like Keki Tarapore, I think if I pronounce it right, Ramakant Achrekar for Sachin Tendulkar, and Desh Azad for Kapil Dev trained their wards to follow this principle. 10,000 hours, which basically what this part of the book is stressing on is how important it is to practice. So even for equity investors, you will only get better as you practice. If you're just going to consume all of this whole load of knowledge that we have, in fact, consumed over the past 2 months, and if you're not going to sit and practice everything that you have learned, then it's of no use all that you have learned because it's not going to help you in any way. Now, the next is, while many middle class schoolboys growing in India's big metros might have access to the coaching and batting facilities that Dravid did, where Dravid really pulled away from his peers both before and after he started playing cricket, was in his appetite for practice. So he was the first to tell the world how seriously Dravid took net practice. If you see here, this stresses upon how he was so serious and how he was so hell-bent and focused on his practice. He did not sacrifice his practice. Now, then secondly, in addition to his strengths, Rahul was one of the first to start using set routines and mental conditioning techniques to improve his game. The remarkable thing is that he seemed to have started these routines when he played cricket as a schoolboy. So as a roommate, Rahul was difficult as well as easy to share with. He wanted a zen-like atmosphere in the room, everything peaceful and calm. He was quiet and meditative, would not watch TV much, and he read books instead. He had his set routines and rituals even in those days. He would do breathing exercises and clean his nostrils using the ancient practice of Jalneti. It was very boring. So as to how he started using meditation as a tool for preparation. Okay, so what Dravid responded is, I took to it quite young. I was just drawn to it. I did it a couple of times at 18, 19, some basic form of meditation. I think I got better with age. It started off with trying to do some relaxation to calm myself down in some ways. And I've experimented with a few things, but I found that it was a handy way to relax and switch off. So, this basically what I'm speaking about is the mental conditioning. And even in, even many books and all, many videos that I've watched, some of the best traders had a very, good routine in terms of mental conditioning. They used to meditate a lot. So even when there was a falling market or there were losses that were coming in, they would just take 5 minutes off, meditate, and come back to the screen to then reevaluate their position and plan how to go about the trades. What happens as a result is emotions don't get the better of you, so you don't make hasty, stupid decisions. Instead, with meditation, you're making logical, reasonable decisions. So this is what this part of the book is speaking about. Okay, so the sum total of everything we have discussed so far allows you to visualize not just a supremely skilled cricketer, but also one whose mental condition has given him enormous reserves of mental strength. Dravid himself pulled the entire construct together in an interview he did for Cricinfo editor Sambit Bal in 2004. So we could read this maybe. I try to have as many nets as possible in the last couple of days before the match. When I feel comfortable with my game, I stop. Then I start thinking about the match. I look at the wicket. I try to analyze the kind of bowlers I will be playing, their strengths and weaknesses. In other words, he will look at the company, equity investor look at companies, evaluate the strengths and weaknesses. I try to analyze so I replay in my mind the memories of my last encounter with them. So he will, in other words, he will not make mistakes twice. He will try to, recollect the memories with those players. So in the case of an investor, with the companies and what the last experience was like. What did I learn from it? What can I take away from it? I look at videos if they are available, and if a bowler got me out last time, I try to think about how I got out, what mistake I committed. So similarly, if a company has messed up a trader's financial gains or something of that sort, what you need to do is you need to sit back and evaluate what went wrong last time and don't make the mistake again. And I do my best to be in a relaxed state of mind because that's when I play at my best. I try to slow things down a couple of days before the game. I have long lunches, do things in an unhurried way. The morning of the match, I always get up a couple of hours before we have to get to the ground so that I have plenty of time to get ready. So what can we learn from this part is simply that, before is don't just directly get up and sit in front of the trading terminal. Take some time off, relax, do all of your things, and then sit in a relaxed state of mind in front of the computer before you make a buy or a sell or whatever it may be. I take my time to have a bath, wear my clothes, eat breakfast, everything. I never rush things. That sort of sets up my mood for the rest of the day. Then, if the facilities permit, I have a net at the ground. In other words, when you're, it's very important to sort of train your mind because if you're just going to go ahead with a trade, what's going to happen in a hasty manner is you're going to have emotions that is going to get the better of you. Now, when emotions get the better of you, that is when you mess up your trades because you have two possible emotions. You have fear and greed, right? So both of these emotions can come forward and mess up a trade for you or an investment, which is why it is so important to condition your mind the way he has. You need to sit, meditate, and be extremely focused and calm. So the third thing is he sought feedback from his peers and introspected on it to understand his weaknesses. So he didn't just sit and do whatever the hell he wanted to. He would have a record of everything. So similarly, you need to maintain a record of your investments and all. Go to a third party who's probably experienced. Ask him to evaluate your decisions and correct you and on areas you can improve and do better. So if you see this also one of his Akash Chopra has beautifully described when he started out, Dravid used to crouch a lot more in his stance with his head falling over a bit towards the offside. His bat coming from the direction of gully forced him make a huge loop at the top of the backlift. Both the backlift and the falling head allowed him to punish anything that was even marginally on his legs. His wide backlift also made him a good cutter of the ball, provided there was width on offer. On the flip side, it meant fewer front foot shots of the offside. So the knowledge of where his off stump was, coupled with immense patience, ensured that Dravid continued to score bucketfuls of runs in Test cricket, in spite of the bowlers finding him out. But though the runs were coming, they were not coming as briskly as he would have liked. He had to stay longer at the crease to accumulate his runs, and that eventually cost him his place at the ODI team. He needed to find ways to open up his offside play. Okay, so you might have, so again in this last line, it must have taken hundreds of hours of practice to get into his system so as to make it absolutely seamless. Dravid went through the grind, very important. Nice. So even this is one important thing. Okay, so basically will help you understand what happens when you have a bad day in the market. At the end of the day's play, he may be thinking about it. His batting may bother him, but at that point he can compartmentalize his life very well. He won't order room service or brood indoors. He would rather go out, find something to do, go to a movie or watch musicals, which he loves. He will walk out to the sea or go to the bookstore. Basically, he'll just go out for a break when he has had a bad day. So what happens as a result is even when you're an investor or a trader, when you have a bad day, and if you go to if you don't, take some time off to get over it, you'll end up making fearful decisions, which may end up messing up your success in the market. So if you see here, the last line to conclude today's, today's session, the greatest investors, like the greatest Test cricketers, are a combination of strong technical skills and a growth mindset. Okay, so this is what these are some of the very interesting and very interesting insights that this book had given me, which I today brought out for you guys. So yeah, any questions, anything? Any questions?
No, nothing from my side.
Okay, how did you guys find the book, the insights?
I think the insights are pretty awesome. I think it's explained in a very simple language, like people who are
Correct.
learning also can understand what he's trying to say.
Exactly. So that is, this is one of the reasons why I love Saurabh Mukherjee's books, is because he's very, one thing, he's very humble in his approach when he writes a book, and he's also very, very simple. So even a person who doesn't know much about finance can understand what is going on. So yeah. What about Vedant, Daniel, Lindolf? Any inputs?
I like the way you used people from different backgrounds and different fields to explain a concept,
Correct.
meaning the same thing.
Yeah, true.
And he broke down the Dravid analogy very well. I mean, he introduced different elements of it and then explained it to the teams. So that was really nice.
Correct. Yeah, that's true. He did that part really well. Yeah.
I think I got a lot of insight of the ways when I'm approaching the market are some of the ways in which it looks simple, but it's not that simple. Like
Exactly.
so yeah, definitely a read which I will do. And
Yeah,
I've
you
enjoyed
should,
the
you
book.
should.
It looks very interesting. And
Yeah,
using
very
real life
nice.
examples is
Yeah,
very good.
very true. Lindolf, any inputs?
No, man, very well explained by you, especially. It was a good run through the book, and I'm really interested in reading it right now. So,
Yeah,
do me a
that's
favor
true.
and send me the.
Yeah, for sure I will. Yeah.
Also, it's quite surprising that he's given out all his secrets, man.
Yeah, in fact, that is this is something that draws viewers to Saurabh Mukherjee, the fact that he's so transparent with his approach, and yeah, I mean, I think that's really what helps Saurabh Mukherjee stand out, is the way he shares some of the greatest experiences and lessons that he's had, which really gives especially a beginner good insight. So yeah, I guess we'll conclude today's session. I'll see you guys for the next upcoming sessions. Yeah. So I'll see you guys. Take care.
All right.
Thanks, Ram.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.